Good morning, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. We got a very good episode planned for you today. I actually have a guest who has been gracious enough to join us on here, so we're going to try and blaze through these channel housekeeping things very quickly so we can get straight to our guest. So I want to remind you guys, we were supposed to have a new series aired yesterday. Unfortunately, it's a little bit difficult to get everything all set, and make sure it's written well and all that kind of stuff. So it'll probably actually be posted today. And I appreciate you guys' patience with that, but nonetheless, we'll be coming here soon. We got an open mic tomorrow. Tomorrow is Friday. Tomorrow is Friday. So we'll have an open mic tomorrow night it's going to be Friday, of course. If you guys are interested in that, definitely consider showing up. Should be around 10 p.m. Mountain Time. Also, Saturday, we'll be airing an episode of Hogsmeade again for Pentecost. And next week, we actually are going to have two interviews on August the 10th. Both are going to be with, David Roll's not a Christian. Anyways, we'll be talking with David Roll at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Going to be discussing his new books, Legendary Kings. And then later on that same day, we'll be talking with Chris Date about physicalism. That'll be at about 6 p.m. And again, that's Mountain Time. Want to remind you guys also, we got 3 debates coming up this month. August the 12th will be with Will Kinney on open theism. August the 20th with David Preston on modern translations. And August the 31st with Turretin Fan on conditional immortality. All of those will be over at Standing for Truth's channel. Please consider subscribing to Standing for Truth's channel while you're at all this. And I think that's actually everything. I wanted to make sure to get through that pretty quickly. Like, share, subscribe. Make sure to hit that a notification bell to get notified every time we go live, different social media and whatnot. And yeah, let's just go ahead and jump right into the episode today. So we have a guest. That is TJump. Thank you very much for being here, TJump.
Hey, is that a wolf and a lamb in the background? It's like,
it is. It's actually a reference to a Bible passage of Isaiah 11. Talks about the wolf and the lamb lying together in heaven. The particular significance of it to me is that wolves, biblically speaking, are kind of like pigs, right? And also biblically speaking, in the sense that they're not looked on very fondly. And so the idea that this creature that's looked on as kind of a detestable creature is actually in heaven lying with lambs, which are seen to be pure and all that kind of stuff is kind of, well, I don't know. It's a beautiful thing, in my opinion. You know what I mean? But at any rate, that is the painting there.
Cool. So topic was God morality stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Wanted to just have a kind of free-flowing conversation here about ethics. By the way, audience, we'll be going for about an hour, probably. So let's just go ahead and jump right into some of the questions. Well, first off, just some brief background in case anybody here doesn't know you. Who's TJump? Why might we want to have a conversation with TJump as opposed to some other random guy?
I am a professional bathtub salesman, a very famous bathtub salesman. I do lots of sales of ceramics, and I sit in comfy chairs often.
For sure. And of course, you would be probably most well known for some of your debates on modern day debate, right? I think my first debate on modern day debate was actually with you. It might not have been first, might have been second or third, but either way, very early in there.
Sure.
So you have your own kind of like ethics system, right? Based off of imposition of will and things like that. Is that correct?
Yep.
So if you wouldn't mind, explain a little bit about that. What exactly is the, first off, what's imposition of will for the audience's sake? And second off, what is the importance of it to your ethical system? I know it's probably a little bit obvious, but just in case anybody's unaware.
Imposition of will is doing things people don't consent to. That's what it is. That's what I think the evidence of morality looks like. If we follow the patterns of moral intuition, moral progress, that's what it leads to. Definitely not God. God is the wrong answer for morality.
For sure. So then we'll just go ahead and jump right into it and pursue that a little bit. Would you say that all instances of imposition of will are immoral, or is there like asterisks there?
Involuntary. All involuntary impositions of will.
So with things like, for example, prison,
Yep.
do you have, well, and let's just actually ask that as an open-ended form instead. What do you think what do you think should be done for somebody who has committed some kind of egregious crime, murder, sexual assault, anything like that? Obviously, we impose
Well, it
their
just
will.
shouldn't be possible. It just shouldn't be possible for that to happen. That's what a moral universe would look like.
But so in our own universe, though, do you have a way you would want to
Doesn't
preferably
matter.
deal with
It's
that?
irrelevant to morality. So morality is the world where it can't happen. So prisons aren't relevant to morality. What objective morality looks like is what the perfect universe looks like, not what our universe looks like. So they're separate questions. Has nothing to do with morality. What we should do to prisoners. It's a pragmatic question, not a moral question.
Would you still, on that note, then, would you still agree with the pragmatism of it, like separated from the moral question? Is it still a pragmatic thing to do? Is it in line at least with morality?
It's not a moral thing. It's a pragmatic thing. They're separate completely. It's definitely pragmatic. It's definitely not moral.
So, and that's an interesting thing because I think most people would probably consider that explicitly moral. In other words, most people I think would probably say something along the lines of that's the whole reason we, throw them in jail in the first place is to, have justice served and something like that.
Nope, that's typically not what people say. So in the polls in philosophy, that's actually immoral. Justice is immoral. It's more out of necessity, not morality. It was pretty demonstrably shown by Sam Harris and his models of, well, if we could just cure them, we just let them go.
Well, and to be clear, I think more specifically when I was saying most people, I think I'd be referring to just lay people, not necessarily philosophers.
So was I. So like the polls show that justice is immoral. Punishing people is immoral. If we can cure them, the moral thing to do is to cure them and not punish them.
All right, and that's I think the first place where I would disagree, not on the polls themselves, although I haven't actually ever, I guess, seen that. But so for me, I think I would take the position that the punishment of evil is in and of itself a moral good, or at least a moral better, for kind of a weird term. It does seem to me like if you are in a position where somebody's committed some egregious crime, that crime does actually have some kind of almost like a wage to it that needs to be punished. I'm sure you'd have a problem with that, right? So,
well, yeah, there's the sixth grade. We proved that one wrong. Two wrongs don't make a right.
Well, is that so? I guess then my question there would be: is that something that's just proven, or something that people have, I guess, just said? So, and let me give an example of that for the audience sake.
Well,
warfare is obvious.
Jump on that real quick. There's no evidence of objective morality. There's no like proof of objective morality. The best evidence is just a product of evolution. So when we're talking about which model is the better model, we're talking about which one best explains the data, best answers the moral dilemmas, and that kind of thing. And so you can say, right now, the best explanation is evolution explains all of morality, and there is no objective morality until one of the models makes novel testable predictions. And until then, the answer is evolution caused it. And then if we're trying to say, well, what is the best contender for objective morality, then we're talking about the coherence of the model and which model is better. And so you never prove it, right? The best we can do is say, I guess, to try and put percents on it. There's like, let's say there's a 10% chance morality is objective or something. Of that 10% chance, which model is the most likely one to be the top 10%? And that's the closest you can get to proof. So my model is closer to being proof than the God model. The God model is like negative 7%. It's like as wrong as you can get. But if we're talking about potential contenders for an objective model, mine definitely has significantly more basis and evidence than the God model.
So if we are just to weave a analogy for the audience, if we had a situation like a war, right? I would take the position that killing is a immoral act, right? And obviously that's precisely what soldiers are doing, right? They're going out and killing people, at least in the middle of the battlefield, right? Now in that situation, chances are you're in the war for some reason, right? Obviously, there's plenty of wars that happen for no reason, but let's just take something that's obvious to most people, like World War II. You got somebody attacking Pearl Harbor. There's your reason. So the following in the not wording this correctly. The way that my brain would basically kind of look at this, the way that I kind of look at this is like, all right, you have two choices. One choice is an evil act, namely shooting the Japanese guy, and another choice is an evil act, namely letting him overrun your home. So you're stuck between two different immoral acts, but one act is more immoral than the other. In other words, there's values you could attach to each of those moral facts, and one of those moral facts is going to outweigh the other, namely protection of you and your own. To me, that just seems to be the nature of objectivity, right? One is of lesser value than three is of lesser value than one. If those aren't objective, then that's not necessarily true. And you could actually give an example of that, like, for example, in sports.
Well, it's correct that for there to be an objective measurement system, they have to be objective, clearly. But right now we're saying that there is no evidence they're objective. There's only evolution. That's the only empirical evidence we have to explain anything regarding morality is evolution. And then we want to say, well, which model? Say evolution is 90% chance of being correct and explaining everything about morality, and there's a 10% chance morality is objective. Then I'm a moral realist, you're a moral realist, so we're fighting within that 10%. We want to say, well, who has the better explanation to qualify as that 10% chance? And so there is no objective evidence. All we're doing is just saying what is the best explanation of the data we can give, given our little 10% corner of the data. And so there isn't objective evidence that morality actually has these numbers that are true, independent of stance independent morality. And so it's a separate stage of the debate. The first one is if you're talking about objective evidence, evolution wins. It beats both our models hands down. Second stage is, well, which model, if objective morality does exist, which model is more coherent, and the God model or the non-God model?
No, right, and I certainly wouldn't disagree with the notion that, we don't have like scientific proof for anything or mathematical proof or anything like that would demonstrate to us morality's existence, right? But what I'm saying is if we assumed that 10% were true just for a moment, and we had two different moral facts, when we have other things that are objective, like I think, well, I guess there is an open debate as to whether or not numbers are objective, right? But nonetheless,
gravity, world is flat. World is not flat. World is not flat. So there's objective things for sure.
Yeah, right. And when those things are objective, you can start to like deduce things like their value. And the reason I use numbers is because if we take the value of numbers, 3 is an objectively greater value than 1, right? Now you can fudge that by way of, like, for example, a sports system. In golf, you want less points, right? Whereas obviously in football, you want more points. So those individual systems have created their own numbering rules in such a way that 3 is no longer more value than 1 or something like that. But if you're just talking, typically you have $3, that means you have more dollars than $1, right? You have 3.
Sure. We can give numbers to things, and we can't always measure objective things, but we can assign numbers to them, sure, as like a representation.
Right, and so
Genius Trax asks, he's making fun of your closet. He's saying you're streaming from your closet. He says, ask CJ if that's this JC Penney's changing room.
It is actually a closet. I'm not going to lie. It's a more enclosed area, so it makes me sound a little better.
That actually makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. Appreciate that, actually, because I'll be honest, a lot of people just decide to poke a lot of fun at that, which I get it. I mean, he's in the closet, right? It's why would you not? Anyways, so the main reason I use the numbers thing is not necessarily to make any sort of a claim about numbers or anything like that, right? It's just simply to say, if I were to have a system of objective numbers, I could say definitively 3 is more than 1. But if those weren't objective, if 3 could mean 10 or 12 or 87.1, then I can't necessarily say that, right? It depends on the particular rules that are being laid out before me. And in the same way, I kind of see things like morality, where you can be put in a situation if you have two moral facts where one fact has greater value than the other. To get this back to our prison question, that would mean the reason it's morally good to imprison somebody, in my view, is that the alternative is worse. And we can say the alternative is worse because both are objectively have some objective value.
Wait, that doesn't make sense. So, like, say stabbing a baby or punching an old lady. Now, one of those is objectively worse than the other, but that doesn't make punching an old lady moral. It's still immoral. It's just it's the necessary evil. So if you have to choose between stabbing a baby or punching an old lady, it's not moral to punch the old lady. It's just a necessary evil because it's the least evil you can do in the situation. So given your definition, it seems like punching the old lady becomes a moral thing, which is why I don't subscribe to utilitarianism, because I don't think that doing the lesser evil is moral. It's just still evil.
So, and obviously, good point. I think that the issue that I tend to have with that is a lot of times when we get into these consequentialist kinds of dilemmas, we are put into situations where it's not just you have like a choice between the two, but if you don't, if you decide not to do one of the things, then the other thing almost necessarily follows, right? So, like for example, with the military example there, right? You either have the choice of stopping the opposing army, usually with force, or of letting them overrun your area there, right?
Yeah, but I'd see that as the same as the punching the old lady versus the stabbing the baby. I don't see a difference between those two. So the fact that you're choosing the lesser evil doesn't make it a moral action. It's still just a lesser evil. So killing someone in self-defense, you're still doing an evil. We can prove it's an evil because is there a more, if you were an all-powerful being, would there be a more moral option? Well, yeah, you could just teleport them or teleport yourself away or make yourself ethereal or give yourself a personal force field. There's infinitely many more options that are less bad than just killing the person. So it's definitely not a moral action that you're doing. It's just a less evil action.
Yeah, see, and I don't even necessarily disagree. It's just I think that there is something to be said about doing the right, or we'll say less immoral thing, given the situation, right? Now, obviously, you wouldn't subscribe to the Bible, but there is a Bible quote talking about, if you know to do good and don't do it, then that's evil. I'd say that that's a fairly, Christian or not, I'd say that that's a fairly correct assessment.
I definitely wouldn't agree with that part. So that part's
wouldn't agree.
That would mean that if you have the option to do something moral, say like I could give all of my money to charity right now and help poor people, I'm not doing that, therefore it's immoral. That would seem wrong. It seems amoral that I'm not giving my money to charity. So I could do a moral action, which is give my money to charity, or give all my possessions to charity, and I'm not doing it. Is that an immoral action? Well, by your quote, it seems to imply it would be, whereas by moral standards, it seems like it would be amoral. It's not immoral to not do something moral. It's only immoral if you do an immoral action.
Yeah, see, and I think that's an interesting area of disagreement, because I think I would disagree there. I think that if I were to have a situation where, I have expendable income and I'm not giving that in any way to somebody who is going to benefit from it, that does seem to me to be morally wrong. And in order for our world to be as perfect as it could possibly be, it would seem like that it would seem like I would have to be doing something to help out those less fortunate than me. Now, it's immoral in a different way than actively committing immorality. In other words, it's more passive. Whereas if I were to go out and slap somebody, that's obviously active. But it does seem to me to be a action where good could have been taken, good was not taken, and as a result, there is more suffering in the world. That seems to me to be relatively immoral, I guess, is just to use the same word we've been using.
So, for example, if someone was infinitely powerful and was watching a baby die of cancer and could help them and didn't do it, that would be immoral.
Actually, yes, I would say that provided that there was, now I'm a Calvinist, so I do believe that there is reasons for certain things that go on in this world, specifically for ordained reasons. So my answer there would be obviously contingent upon that fact. So if there, for example, you have the baby drowning, I would say that there is some thing, whatever thing it happens to be, I don't know, I unfortunately don't have prophetic insight, that causes that to be necessary, or perhaps causes it to be, for the greater good, or however you would want to say it. The exact way that the Bible puts it is all things works together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. But you kind of get the idea that is being set forward there, right?
Yeah, but yeah, was that a rational thing to believe? So, for example, say we were living in Nazi Germany, and in Mein Kampf it said all things Hitler does for some greater good to make the world better, or whatever. We could believe that, and we could say that, oh well, it says it in Mein Kampf, therefore it's true. And then when we see Hitler gas babies to death and them suffer and die, we can be like, oh, well, there's some greater good. He's doing it for the greater good. Or we could think, well, if we look at the evidence, what does the evidence say? We can follow the evidence wherever it leads. Killing babies is bad. He clearly doesn't need to do that, as far as we can tell. Like there's some magical unknown reason that we just don't know about. He could just, not kill them. That would be great.
Right.
And so it seems like the more rational position is probably not to believe that sentence, since all of the evidence seems to point to the contrary. And simply believing it because you want to is not a rational position, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and I think the Hitler example is actually a really good example to use there, because from the human perspective, in other words, as Hitler, as a Nazi, as an American soldier, any of those kinds of people, it's obvious that what Hitler was trying to do was negative, was purely negative. He's trying to take over the world, or at least take over Europe. He's trying to get rid of a certain quote unquote undesirable race, happens to be my own people. So I obviously have a little bit of an emotional attachment to that. But we can just flatly agree as human beings, this is wrong. Now, of course,
the question was more like, from our perspective, when we look at Hitler, say we didn't know what his motivations were. I think his motivations were actually to try to make the world a better place, or something along those lines.
Oh, they were definitely.
But
he was wrong about it. They were.
When we look at the evidence, we can say in his book, it says he has reasons. And when we look at the possibilities that we can imagine, he's very wealthy, has power over the government. He can provide food for the babies. He doesn't need to gas the babies. As far as we can tell, we don't see any such reason. There's no reason that we can imagine where Hitler could not have just chosen not to murder the babies. But it says in the book there's some unknown reason. Should we trust the book that there is some unknown reason that is just out there that we can't imagine, even though it's clearly possible for us to imagine lots of other alternatives? Or should we probably say that's probably false, given all the evidence we have, given we can clearly imagine alternatives where this is not the case? It seems like the reasonable explanation is not to trust that, or that we don't have any evidence to trust that, and all the evidence is to the contrary.
Yeah, and I think that with somebody who is a human being, that's likely true. Now, I would add the asterisk of, if you accept his social Darwinism, then I think he probably was working for the quote greater good. Now, I don't accept social Darwinism, and so I would reject that outright. But if you have a social Darwinist worldview, and you have the ability to get rid of things like mental handicapness, or even just not very athletic people, like if you could create a world where everybody was, Randy Moss or Tim Tebow or something like that. From a social Darwinist perspective, that would be perfectly moral, and in fact would definitely be good. And I don't know if they would have an alternative to doing it, other than perhaps, maybe now, almost 100 years in the future, we are able to do things like, what do they call that? There's a term for it, but basically when you edit the baby in the womb.
Gene modification.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
But the question was more like, from our perspective, you can forget whatever the motivations of Hitler might be. Say we just don't know. The only evidence we have is we have a book that says he has some unknown reasons that justify all of his actions, and we have our imagination. We can clearly see, if I had the power Hitler had, if I had the money Hitler had, clearly I wouldn't need to drown or to gas babies. I'd be like, nope, we're just not going to gas the babies. We're going to feed them. We're going to let them go. We're not going to gas them. Seems like a very plausible option. If I was in his situation, I could clearly do this. And so in this case, is it rational to believe what the book says? And it doesn't matter who this is talking about. It doesn't matter if it's talking about Hitler or God or Dumbledore or magic leprechauns. It doesn't make a difference what it's talking about. The question is if we are comparing, there's a sentence in the book that says there's some unknown reason that justifies these heinous actions, and contrast that to our knowledge that we, if given this power, could clearly do something differently and less immoral. Which is the more rational thing to trust?
I think the ultimate point I'm trying to get at is that I completely would agree with your example with Hitler, and I wouldn't with God. And I think the situation of the Holocaust is a very interesting example. So if we were to have a divine perspective, which nobody does, right? But in 1925, what we would not have known, that Hitler also himself would not have known, but that provided a God does exist, God would have known, is that the end result of this is going to be a litany of incredibly positive things. So, for example, the stateless people being abused here, namely the Jews, are going to have a state by the end of this. The fractured and very isolationist world is going to be open to each other after this. A lot of people are going to have incredibly advanced technology, bringing themselves out of what is essentially their own extended dark ages after this, like Russia, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, all these other kinds of places.
But the Bible
in other
doesn't
words,
say so. Like the Bible doesn't give any of the actual reasons. It doesn't say these are the reasons of that he's doing that. So it doesn't give any examples of what the future examples are. So all we have to go off of is our knowledge and the sentence in the Bible where he says there's some justifiable reason. Charles asked, what is social Darwinism? I think he means eugenics in order to call out weak or bad genes. That's like what I think he means by eugenics. Also, Mel Via says, huge Vikings fan. I appreciate that CJ mentioned Randy Moss. Super chat. Thank you. So the argument here is that I can imagine not gassing babies. It's very easy. If I was in Hitler's position, I could not gas babies. I could do it very clearly. If I was in God's position, I could very easily cure all cancer with the snap of my finger, all powerful being and all. And so given my current abilities of my intellectual capabilities, I can see, given the power that the leader has, whoever the leader is, I could clearly do things differently. And whatever hypothetical positive good you can imagine, I can get that and without cancer. No child cancer. I can get whatever positive good you could ever imagine. Anything you could ever say, I'm going to be able to say, I can get that without child cancer. And so the fact that it says in the Bible, there is this unknown magical reason that no one can ever imagine that justifies these heinous actions doesn't seem to make sense, because no matter what action you could ever list, I can always get it without child cancer and pretty much anything else. I can get pretty much any positive good, no matter what you list, without any involuntary imposition of will whatsoever if I was an all-powerful being. And so it seems irrational to trust that sentence. It seems much more rational that it's just wrong, and it's something that either God is lying, or that people made it up because they wanted to believe in their God had justified reasons, even though it didn't exist. And so it seems like the rational thing to believe here is not that the God genuinely has some kind of unimaginable reason that we can never, ever comprehend. It seems much more likely that, no, we can actually just solve this. If we had all power, there wouldn't be an excuse.
Well, I don't know if it would be necessarily unimaginable. I think that would be one thing I'd want to briefly push back on, only because it does talk about things which are relatively vague, certainly, like all things work together for good, right? Or for and those are specifically for us, all things work together for those who are called according to his purpose. There's also the God has made all for his own glorification, even the wicked for the day of destruction. That's in Proverbs. Now that's a little bit, I think, less vague than just your own good, but even the own good instance, I think that is something you can see in the different events through history. Like I said, with that example of Israel.
Wait, what was the greater good thing?
So the first quote is from Romans. It's all things work together for good for those who were called according to his purpose. And then
I got that part, but I meant so my argument is that any greater good you could ever logically possibly express, if I was an all-powerful being, I could get you that good without the drowning of the babies. So if it's the case that no matter what, in all logically possible worlds that any human being could ever express, whatever this greater good may be, if we expressed all possible greater goods that could ever be logically expressed in a human brain, no matter what they are, I'm going to be able to say I can get that without the drowning babies thing. If I was an all-powerful being, and I can just give you a method of how to do that. And if that's the case, it seems like it's irrational to think that there is some extra human brain kind of reason that is just beyond our comprehension that's just out there. It seems more rational to say, no, it's just wrong. It seems like we should just say the authors of the Bible were just wrong, and God probably doesn't exist, and they just wanted to believe this, and so they added that in as kind of like an ad hoc justification for evil. And so the counter I'm looking for is like, can you give me, because you said it wasn't going to be logically impossible, or that it wouldn't be outside of human imagination. And so I would need like an example of what a greater good in that we can literally imagine would be, that I wouldn't be able to imagine a possible world where if I was an all-powerful being, I could get that without the drowning babies.
Well, and I'll just say flatly, I don't know if I would necessarily be able to do that. And given the parameters of our own world, I don't know if such a thing would necessarily be possible. And so what I think the question then, in sort of to push back on, would be, why are the parameters set up in such a way that they are? Especially if we were to assume the God hypothesis for a moment, why does he set up such a world that people have what seems to be free choice, or people have, what seems to be this idea of like a guilt, or any, all the different things you can list that exist in our world, right?
Well, I'm happy to have all of those things, but you don't need. I can have all of those without the babies drowning. So those.
I don't necessarily think that part's true. And I think actually,
let me phrase it. Is it logically possible? Logically possible means there's no logical contradiction in a world where people have free will and God did not flood the world and drown all the babies.
I guess I wonder about that. I don't know if it would be logically impossible for someone to always use their will in a good way. I do think it would be irrational. I don't think somebody would ever have a free will that was such that they always wanted to do good things, at least barring some kind of divine intervention.
So I said, is it possible to have a world with free will? And so this is we still have murder and rape and all those bad things. But God didn't drown all of the babies in the global flood. That's the only thing that's different. No drowning babies. God did not drown the babies. No child cancer, no drowning babies. Those are the only two differences. Everything else in the world is the same.
No, yeah, there's certainly no logical contradiction there. My reason for bringing up the evil, though, is because the flood is a punishment, right? So then the question would become, is it possible for somebody who has free will to always act in a good way, such a way that God would not want to judge them? Because that's the whole purpose of that story, is judgment, right? It's possible, it's logically possible. You can't mathematically disprove it or anything like that, right? But I don't think it's possible in another.
So like the two points there is, one, that if it's logically possible to have, imagine if I was an all-powerful being, I could rewrite the world, and it's logically possible that I can get all of the positive benefits with at least one less evil, like drowning babies or whatever, then I've demonstrated that it's God would be immoral in this case, because of like the examples we gave before. Punching an old lady isn't the moral thing to do. It's just a less immoral thing to do. So if God didn't do the moral thing, he just did a less immoral thing, that would mean he's immoral. If he had the power, as you mentioned, if he has the power to help people but didn't, that makes him immoral. And so my fundamental question is, if any possible benefit that could ever be logically expressed can be gained without the negative consequences, and I think I can go for all of them. I can get rid of every single one of the bad things and still have all of the good things. So free will, you can still have it. Guilt, you can still have it, and you can't murder anybody. I think those are there's no contradiction between those statements, and I can express a logically possible world that has both of those. And so the question you have to ask is, if all of the goods can be kept and all of the evils can be gotten rid of, and there's no logically possible good that can be presented with any human mind that can't be explained in this way, then you have to say that, well, there's some other good that is just beyond human comprehension. It's beyond logically possible worlds. And that is the reason why God is justified, and we are just completely incapable of ever imagining it or expressing it. And is that a reasonable thing to believe? Or is it more reasonable to believe that because every logical possible good that we can ever express, given our brains and logic, can be explained and created in a possible world without suffering or involuntary suffering, is it more rational to believe that this sentence was just something that a bunch of like goat herders added into their belief system in order to try and vindicate the cognitive dissonance of believing that their all perfect God drowned babies?
Well, I think, to be fair, it was probably more along the lines of their own persecutions and wanting to rationalize that. So if I were to put on my atheist cap, I think it would probably be, Paul is persecuted basically everywhere he goes. Probably wants to rationalize his persecution. But nonetheless, I get your point, right? I think one of the major differences, though, that I would have to come back to is just this this claim, biblically speaking, of the punishment of evil being a good thing, right? So when we bring up the logical contradiction, right, I think there's more than one way something can be impossible. It can be logically impossible, like a square circle, right? It could also just be functionally impossible, meaning it just would never happen. You could have a Google situations to the power of a Google, and it still wouldn't happen, right? And I think in a situation where you have creatures with free moral agency, that's probably something that you could put in that realm of it's never going to happen, of them always operating in a positive light. Well, now you have a situation like the flood. The flood is meant to be a judgment on people who are using their autonomy for evil purposes. Now, the question, of course, then at that point would be if we could accept that first premise of free creatures, it's just statistically unlikely that free creatures will not do immoral acts. Then there's that second point of then is it are you justified in destroying a civilization that is reached a certain level of wickedness? And I think given the parameters of our world, namely given a world where he's decided we do have a level of free moral agency, I do think it's compatible this level of free moral agency, but nonetheless, it is still there. All the different things that would go into it, like guilt and divine plan and stuff like that. Is it rational to destroy a civilization that has reached a certain level of evil? I would say yes. I wouldn't see anything morally wrong with the taking out of like a Nazi Germany or a Confederacy, or in the case of the flood, the entire world having got to such a point that they are committing whatever acts that they were committing. It's not real specific as far as what was going on. It does say the world was filled with violence. So whatever it was violent. But I think you probably get the point I'm making. I think that the punishment
not
itself,
exactly. So like the reason I bring up the babies is because essentially you're saying God punished the babies because of all the evil on the planet, and that doesn't make any sense. The babies clearly didn't do anything. Like you can't be a baby and be a rapist, a murderer. Like God, it doesn't make sense to say God flooded the world to punish all of the innocent babies who did nothing wrong. And so you can't say that the flood was a punishment for evil because the people he punished were innocent of evil. And then the second thing you mentioned was that free creatures, you said there's no way to create free creatures who won't not act on their desire to do evil or something along those lines. Like I can do that easily. I can say you can have 100% free will, but everybody has a personal force field. So even though you may want to murder somebody and you may try your best to murder somebody, it's physically impossible. So you still act on your desires. It's just physically impossible for you to murder anybody. And so you still have all the free desires and you can act on them as much as you want, but it's physically impossible for the action to actually have an effect on another person. So I can have all of that easily as a logically possible world I could create. So I can have all the positives of free will and all the positives of guilt and all the positives of immoral desires and none of the murder very easily. So I don't think that really addresses the question.
Well, I think that would kind of destroy the parameters of our world, though, wouldn't it? Because, like, for example, if we have personal force fields around, I mean, you couldn't even give your brother a hug, or
yeah, you could. You can turn it off
with a woman or something like that.
Yeah, you could. You could turn it off. So
you could turn it off, and you could
the force field,
murder somebody, right?
The force field only applies to non-consensual actions. So if you consent to it, then it's totally fine. So it's a consensual force field. It only stops non-consensual actions.
So sort of like just a mental thing. Would it just like recognize, hey, I'm consenting to this. Hey, I wouldn't. Is that kind of where you're going with the idea? Just so
there's many ways to accomplish that, but God, all powerful being. So that's not really a challenge. It's not really a challenge to the question. So we can do that in lots of ways. I'm all powerful. Of course I can do that.
Well, and it does seem to me to be, and of course, here we are, we're talking about, hypotheticals, but for the record, if we were to have this kind of a hypothetical situation, I'm sure I could imagine a situation where I could trick somebody into getting their force field off, thus allowing me to murder them. In fact, I think that's one of the major ways we had. Just think of like the recent, Me Too movement. Not to get into any of the politics of it.
Well, just to clarify, so the force field's operating system is run by God's mind. So God's mind is omniscient; it knows everything. So the person may not know that you're trying to kill them, but the force field does because it's run on God's mind. So there's no way for you to trick God's mind to make the force field accidentally shut off.
Sorry, I think you might have paused there a minute. Does the last words you said off?
Yes, last word I said was off.
All right, then I heard everything. Yeah, and so in that kind of a situation, I guess that's certainly a possibility. He could have done that if he wanted to. I guess I would probably have to think of it for longer than right now than just a quick answer, but to see if I could find any potential pitfalls there. But I will grant that it is hypothetically possible that God could create a little world where everybody had force fields he controlled, thus disallowing anybody to do something to that individual. Let's see. I wonder if I could. So let's say something like fraud. Well, first off, let me ask: would you consider fraud to be immoral?
What is fraud?
Let's see. Let's do a dictionary definition of fraud. That way, we won't have any sort of argue about the potential definition here. So, wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. Would you consider that immoral?
Well, I mean, it's like it's in the question, the definition. It says it's immoral, but it says wrongful. But
yeah, I guess that's true. So we'll just say then deception intended to result in financial or personal gain.
So it can be like if we were in my world, my best of all possible worlds, no, you could. It's impossible. So it wouldn't make a difference. So the way I would design the world, if I was the all-powerful being, I would say everybody gets to design their own universe, and you get to have a full list of all possible actions, and you get to put each action on either an allowed list or a not allowed list. And any of the actions you put on the allowed list are things that you consent occurring in your universe. So if someone puts fraud on the list and they want to allow it, that's fine. They can do that. But if it's on the not allowed list for someone's universe, well, then it be like the personal force field. It would not be possible to occur in that universe. And so even if you would like to count it as an immoral thing, I can still have that and have it be impossible and still have all of the free will.
So I do notice, though, in that situation, you say that we'd each have kind of like our own little universes, right? So it's kind of like it's almost like a almost quasi-divine nature in a sense, not in the sense that we're like actually gods, but in the sense that we are kind of dictating what goes on in our own bubbles. Well, greater than our own bubbles, I guess, in our own universes.
No more than you have in any given computer game. So it's not like you actually created the universe. You don't have God creation powers. God just gives you a tablet with a bunch of computer code on it, and you can just select the options. So it's still God doing all of the work. You don't have any extra powers. You're still exactly the same human you are now. The only difference is that God is allowing you to select the options for your universe, like ice cream.
Well, right, but in the situation, what I mean by quasi-divine isn't that you're like replacing God or anything like that per se, as much as it is just that you end up being the demiurge of your own universe. Through his power, certainly.
I forget the word, quasi-divine when I mess with my video game settings?
Well, your video game setting is fictional, though, right? In other words, you're not really interacting with a like a physical being when you go in your Minecraft game or whatever. I play Minecraft, so that's why I use that example. You go in your Minecraft game, you see a creeper. That creeper's not real. It has no consciousness of itself, right? You're not interacting with an actual being. Whereas if you had the ability to control your own universe, any beings you interact with would be real. Any animals you interact with would be real.
So right now it's just you in the universe. So there's only one conscious being, and it's you and God. And so the universe has no consciousnesses in it. It's just we're setting the laws of physics here. The laws of physics are not conscious. So you setting the laws of physics in your universe of murder not allowed, rape not allowed, fraud allowed. There's no interaction with any consciousness there. So it's exactly like the video game analogy. It's not You're just making the settings of the video game. That's it. You're not interacting with anybody.
Right, but eventually you will be, right? That's the intention of having things like you can't murder. Obviously, you're not going to say you can't murder if there's not going to be any conscious creatures around, or any creatures in general, I should say.
Right. So like if I design a video game and I invite someone to play my video game, I'm now interacting with another conscious agent and they are abiding by the rules of my video game.
Well, so let's say hypothetically you had nobody who wanted to interact with you and play your video game, right? Now you have the ability to kind of mess with your own universe. Do you have the ability to create somebody who would want to interact with you? No. So then it seems to me that in that situation, you're not really capable of, and I guess a video game would even be a good way to compare that. You're not really capable of doing anything greater than what you're just capable of doing in your own day-to-day life. Like, for example, I could set up the rules of my house, and if nobody wants to be under the rules of my house, they just have to not show up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But that could happen in our own world, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So then what would make that something that we need, like a hypothetical world to create? In other words, if this world was created,
it goes further. So like murder is impossible. You can put it on the impossible actions list. That means like if someone was in your home, it would be physically impossible for them to murder anybody. That would be great. We should have that. That would be a great feature to have here in the real world, but we don't technically have the technology to do that yet. We will eventually, but we don't yet. And so the reason we need this hypothetical is to say, if I was an all-powerful being, then I could allow you to select all of the actions, to give you a list of all possible actions that can occur and let you choose which ones are on the allowed and which ones are on the not allowed list. That would make it physically impossible to do anything on the not allowed list, as opposed to it just being like voluntary. So if someone comes into your home and your personal home and your rule is they can't murder you, well, they're choosing to abide by that rule, but they're not physically prevented from doing so. Whereas if in your universe you set one of the rules as it's physically impossible to murder somebody, well, then they literally wouldn't be able to do it even if they wanted to. So that would be the difference.
Fair enough. That's a good point. Obviously you can't physically force somebody not to do something without like restraining them in some way. So I could
and then just to clarify, it wouldn't be like forcing them to not be able to do it. It'd be like personal force field. So if they tried to stab you, you just have a personal force field come up. So it's not like you're literally restraining their actions or physical actions. You could, if they volunteer, you could set your universe up that way, and if they, as long as they consented to it, you could do that. But also, I wanted to say, J&W says CJ is one of the better theists. Who's complimenting you in the chat.
Appreciate that, J&W, very much so. This has been a great conversation so far. In fact, we're already almost done with it. We're 48 minutes.
I can probably go for a little longer. I think I have to check one of my next convoys, but I'll let you know.
Yeah, for certain. So I kind of want to pivot a little bit, unless you want to continue to explore this thought, in which case I'm certainly down. But I did want to ask a question about.
I just like put a pin in it. That's a weird statement, but so my main contention here is that if all logically possible potential reasons, greater goods that humans could ever imagine can all be explained as in a possible world as I can get that and I can do it without involuntary suffering, then it seems like it's irrational to believe that there's some other reason outside of human, like beyond human imagination, that exists. And so the more plausible explanation is that probably there isn't such a thing, and we should probably not accept the Bible's explanation there. And so unless we can provide some kind of humanly coherent, logical, greater good that we can't explain away in a possible world without suffering, then it seems like it's irrational to believe that sentence in the Bible that God is justified for drowning babies or whatever.
Yeah, and I think, and to clarify, part of the big reason I think you would say that, right, is because of the fact that you would say that the punishment of immorality is not in and of itself a moral thing or a moral positive, right? It's something that, to reiterate what you had said earlier, just shouldn't exist in a moral world. On your view, is that right?
Sort of, but I think that would be a separate topic. So I think, like, if we can agree, for example, cancer is not a good thing, tornadoes whatever rocks falling on people, any example of something that is a not perfect universe. If we can create a perfect universe without that one thing, and I think we can do it without any involuntary, because I think involuntary imposition of will is the principle of morality. So I think we can create a universe with no involuntary imposition of morality and still have all of the good God thingies, the good God reasons, whatever they happen to be. But you can pick whatever principle you think is the moral principle. All we have to do is pick one thing. If there's one thing that is sub-perfect that we can create a world without and still has all the free will stuff or whatever the positive is, that proves that the principle I'm arguing for.
So I guess one thing I would be curious on is how far would we want to take the idea of imposition of will? Because there's a lot of things that we impose on that are not, I brought up the example of prisons earlier, but there's other examples too, like even just being born, right? Obviously, you don't have the will to be born, and I can say as somebody who has had periods in my past where I certainly
mean
would
like
have not wanted
conception or actual childbirth after conception?
Well, in the case of me individually, so in other words, my mother has a choice after the conception of whether or not she would want to go through with that. That gets into an abortion question that I don't necessarily want to get to, at least yet. I might, you might come up again, but who knows? But for me, I didn't have any choice, right? I was completely imposed on. My parents decided to do what they did, and then my mom decided to carry me to term, and now I'm here, right?
Well, an imposition is when you have a will and that will is infringed. And so if you don't have a will, like before you were born and then you're created, that's not an imposition on your will, because for it to be an imposition, you have to have a will and it has to go against your will. And so being conceived or created would not be an imposition of will. If, for example, you were in the womb and you didn't want to be birthed, kind of like Stewie, you just didn't want to leave from Family Guy, then it would be an imposition of your will because you didn't want to leave the womb or whatever. But obviously that wouldn't happen in my universe anyway.
So if you have a situation where and everybody's probably met somebody like this who didn't want to be born. They're depressed. They're psychologically distraught in such a way that they hate their life.
You mean they wish they hadn't been born?
Yeah, there you go. That would be correct. Now, obviously, it's kind of after the fact. I do get your point, right? In other words, they're not, at least to the best of our knowledge, willing to be born or not born while in the womb. But if they live an 80-year life and throughout the 80-year life we're wishing that they weren't born, it does seem like we could say, okay, well, by all effect, it's kind of an imposition of will. It didn't happen at that moment, but they got imposed with life for the next 80 years. And of course, now at that point, you could say, okay, but they could just end their life, but that's a little bit of a different thing, right?
Right. So the question would be more like, it doesn't seem like the birth part was the part that they hate. It seems like the things that happened after the birth are the parts that they hate. So for the birth itself to be an imposition of will, they would have to like literally just hate the fact that they were born and nothing else. Just literally just the fact that they were born is something they hate, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. But for example, if they were severely depressed because they had a terrible life, then the things that they hate were the things that happened to them in life, not the birth factor. And so the impositions wouldn't have been the birth; it would have been all the other things that they hated.
What about like a nihilist? Right. So a nihilist, they're the major imposition of somebody, now psychological nihilism, not philosophical nihilism. So the issue that somebody like that would have would be the meaninglessness of things, the inability to find meaning. I guess that's the same thing with the inability to find worth, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at in that second point. You see this laid out in Ecclesiastes, I think, really well, where he talks about, I've gained all this knowledge, I've lived this great moral life, of gone and drunk a lot and all this other kind of stuff. And all of it was just vanity. I'm just going to die in the end anyways. So his, his, what's the word here? Struggle is not with bad things happening to him. It's actually with good things happening to him and their fleeting nature. And as a result, he concludes it would have been better if he had never been born. Well, that's one of the conclusions. The ultimate conclusion is more of a religious conclusion, of course, because it's a Bible book, but I digress on that. What kind of an answer would we have for somebody like that? Because it's not necessarily what's happening to them that's causing them to dislike life. It's more just...
Well, it is. You said like the thing they dislike was the fleeting nature of happiness or whatever. And so the fleeting nature of happiness is the thing that's the imposition on their will. They don't want it to be fleeting. They want it to be permanent or whatever. And so in that case, in my universe, you just make it permanent. Snap your fingers, make happiness permanent. There you go. It wouldn't be the birthing part that is the imposition of will. It would be the fleetingness of happiness.
So I guess that would be an interesting kind of thing. Would you say that death is an imposition of will?
If you don't want to die, yes, of course.
Yeah. So then I guess you'd probably then conclude that in your world that it would be immoral to die, right? I guess that'd be.
Yes, it's immoral to die against your will. I accidentally just banned someone on Twitter. I gotta go fix that real quick. My bad. My bad, guy in Twitch chat who was chatting, and I just accidentally banned you.
So that's a very interesting kind of thing there. It is a very interesting thing. I want to think about it more. I like the fact that we've explored this because I've talked to you about morals before, and I've never gotten to properly explore what you mean by imposition of will. So this has all been very good. Is this not just kind of a complicated version of subjectivity? That's one thing I do want to kind of. That's what I was kind of. So when something is objective, just take like the color of my sidewalk. It's gray. It's objectively gray. At least if you're, a human being seeing with human eyeballs that function, it's objectively gray, right? I guess you could be colorblind and it might look different, and you might be a shrimp and see in 16 colors. But any human being with a functioning mind, with functioning eyes, or anything like that's going to go out, they're going to see the sidewalk, they're going to see it's gray, right? Now, it seems to me like that's not the definition of objectivity that you would necessarily be rolling with, because different wills can have different ways of being imposed. So, for example, death might be good, but it also might be bad, depending on what the individual will wants.
Yeah, so like euthanasia, if someone wants to die, that's moral to help them die.
Right, so it seems like that's kind of it's almost like what's the Rick and Morty quote? That sounds like X with extra steps. It kind of sounds to me like subjectivity with extra steps.
Well,
everything is
moral subjectivity means there is no objective moral principle, and mine absolutely has an objective moral principle. It's any involuntary imposition of will is immoral, and so it's not, that principle is unaffected by any opinion anyone ever has. That's a universal principle, so it would not be subjectivity. There are obviously some subjective preferences people have, and those preferences can affect what actions you do to them, which are moral or immoral, but the objective principle is the same no matter what anybody thinks.
Is that the only objective principle then would be to...
Yeah.
So in other words, there's nothing...
So any involuntary imposition of will is immoral. Voluntary assistance of wills are moral. Those would be like the description. I'm sure you could boil it down to one principle.
Yeah, and I guess the point I'm getting at with that is just that it's not like, when a theist typically would conceive of objective morals, it's like a list of do's and don'ts, kind of. You're not really operating with a list of do's and don'ts per se, as much as you are, does it follow this principle or does it not follow this principle, kind of thing, right?
Well, those would be the same. So in mine, the don'ts would be don't impose involuntary impositions of will, and the do's would be is do voluntary assistances of will. And so it would still be the same. There's just like in Christianity, it would be like do God's nature or something, and don't do not God's nature. And so you can still boil all of the different laws down to one principle. But that doesn't make it subjective. I mean, in Christianity, I think it does make it subjective because it's based on God's will. But the fact that there's only one principle doesn't make it subjective.
Yeah, and I think from the perspective of a theist, it seems subjective, but I think I can, you do obviously have at least a principle, so it's not just completely random. I guess I would say there's like levels of the objectivity here in a way, but what would you say to somebody who it is in their will to want to impose on somebody else's will? So classical example is a serial killer, right? That's what they find fun for some reason. Who knows why? There's a big psychological thing to go in there, but
I wouldn't say anything to them. It would be impossible for them to act on it.
Would that be an imposition of their will?
No.
Why not?
Because wills only apply to yourself and your property. So your will doesn't have jurisdiction over another person. So if I willed to punch you in the face or something, my will it's not an imposition on my will that I don't get to punch you in the face, because there are two wills in that scenario. And so for it to be a non-imposition of will, all the wills involved would have to consent to the action. So in the case of just the principle itself, any involuntary imposition of will is moral, those only apply to your will and your property. And since you are not my property and you are not my will, it's not an imposition on my will that I don't get to punch you in the face.
But it is something that you want to do that you're prevented from doing, right? So it is, and in the case of one of these,
something I want to do to a different will. So involuntary imposition of wills only apply to yourself and your property. So as soon as I have a will about somebody else, then it's no longer an imposition on my will because it's your will. We're talking about something that involves you. And so the principle, any involuntary imposition of will only applies to yourself and your property. And as soon as you include another will, then it's no longer your will. It's not an imposition on your will. It's an imposition on the group of people involved in this scenario.
Yeah, and I think that the issue I would have there, though, is, if you have somebody who is sadistic for whatever reason, and again, there's obviously the litany of psychological reasons that happens. We don't necessarily need to get into that, but they are certainly not having their, living their best life, so to speak, quote unquote. Jeffrey Dahmer seeks to kill people. That's what makes him happy. He's not able to do so.
I'm not sure what you mean by living their best life.
Well, I'm being a little coy when I say that. Well, my point is just to say they don't have their full pursuit of happiness as a possibility. Now, their pursuit of happiness is wrong. I don't want to, muddy the waters here. I don't think it's okay for somebody to go out and murder people. But it does seem to me like what they will do is explicitly imposition of others' will. That would have to be, because you say the imposition of will only applies to you and your property, that would have to be something you immediately cut off from them, right? But then they have essentially just a miserable existence where they're not able to do the thing that they really wish to do. Now, I think it's okay that they don't have the ability to do the thing which they really wish to do. Well, why is that okay on your model, right? In other words, why is it not, like, their happiness almost seems to be irrelevant in that situation?
Well, right? Happiness is irrelevant. So happiness isn't the goal. It's not like imposition of will isn't the same as get to be happy. Those are two separate things. So like if the principle was what is moral is everybody gets to be happy, then we can just give everyone cocaine and just hook them up to brain dopamine stimulators and make them all happy. So happiness doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if people are happy. What matters is for a moral universe is their involuntary imposition of will. And in my universe, if there was such a being, they could snap their fingers and change their brain to desire something else if they wanted to. That would be an option, but they wouldn't be able to murder other people even if they wanted to. And if they just chose to live in misery, remaining true to their murderous intentions and not changing, but also never being able to experience that, that would be their choice. They could hypothetically create AIs that aren't conscious that could kill in place, and that would be fine, like video game characters, if they wanted to. But yeah, if they wanted to just kill only real souls, real other consciousness without their consent, and were unable to do this, they would just be miserable, and that's their choice. They get to make that choice. Hi, Cosmic QQ from Germany. Thank you for the super chat.
Yeah, and so you can even get, I think, a little bit more exploration of this kind of principle that I'm getting at here too. Like, for example, with something like sexual intercourse, which is not only immensely pleasurable, but is also it's very important for things like intimacy with another person, psychological health, stuff like that. Not to say that celibate people can't be psychologically healthy and stuff like that, but I think you know what I mean there. Obviously, there's no greater level of intimacy than being sexually intimate, at least I would think. That's also obviously something that requires another individual.
Sure.
Now, and it just seems to me like we're in a weird position there, right? Because on one end, it is imposition of somebody else's will if I force them into that. On another end, it is kind of an imposition of my will that I never get to do it if everybody says no. Now, it's an imposition in a different way than you're talking. Certainly, you've already addressed that it's not. That you're speaking specifically about yourself and your own property, freely granted.
Right. That's right. So I would apply it to the exact same thing as before, like if I wanted to punch you in the face. So the fact that if I desired to have sexual relations with another conscious entity with a will and they don't want to do it, That is not an imposition on my will, because the will in that scenario is both mine and theirs. So in my world, again, you could create sex robots and do whatever you wanted to them because they're not conscious. And so you'd still have intercourse. But if you want to have intercourse with another will, then they would have to consent. And if they don't, that is not an imposition on your will, because the wills in that scenario is you and them.
Well, it's not an imposition of will on your model. In other words, what I mean by that is, like, the parameters you've set up is that this is specifically applying to it. It reminds me kind of the non-aggression principle, right? Which is a libertarian principle that basically says you can do anything that you wish so long as you're not actively harming another person. Now that non-aggression principle, depending on who is laying out their exact libertarian model, could have certain elements of change, right? So you're going to have certain people who would say the non-aggression principle means you shouldn't spank a child, whereas other people would say that that level of aggression is not necessarily implied. Now, in that example, it is literally aggressive, right? To spank a child is literally an act of aggression. There's just simply no getting around that. It's definitionally true. But some might have a model that says that's not what we're talking about when we say non-aggression principle, and libertarians will have that conversation. I think we have a similar thing kind of going on here, right? Where it's like, this person wills to do something like have intimacy with another person, or in the case of the sadist, even something much more violent. That's what they seek to do. And we are literally telling them no. In other words, we're imposing on that will. Now, that's not what you mean by imposition of will, granted. But as far as like a dictionary definition, it does seem like that's precisely what we're doing here. And we're just simply conceding, well, because they wish to impose on other wills, it's okay for us to impose on their will, or at least to use their ability to will a certain thing.
Right. So involuntary imposition in my model doesn't mean literally you can do literally anything you want. Like that, I don't think anybody thinks that's the moral standard, that you must be able to literally do literally anything you want. That's not.
No, and that's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I mean is that, like, you can have two different wills wanting two different things, and as a result, it seems like one of those wills has to be squashed. Or it has to be imposed upon, is another way you could put it.
Well, no, again, because then imposition, you're not using the definition of imposition in my model. You're using a different definition. You're using the get whatever you want definition. And that's just not the definition of imposition. So imposition of will means no will in the situation is imposed upon, not just you get what you want. But you keep conflating the imposed as meaning literally get everything you want, which is different than the way I'm using it, which is get what you want in regards to yourself and your property.
Right. So let me just kind of, I guess, boil this down though. Would you though agree that in this instance, if we use the, I said just more general, we could say, I use dictionary as the earlier adjective, but definitions of imposition of will.
Yes.
That will is imposed on, right? In other words, if we're not.
Yeah. So if you're using the global definition of imposition as in not getting everything you want, then yes, it's an imposition that you don't get to rape and murder people. But that's not what imposition means in my model. It's just a completely different definition. So it's an equivocation between two different definitions of imposition. In my model, imposition only applies to things of do you get what you desire in regards to yourself and your property, but it isn't an imposition for you to not get to do things to other people that they don't want you to do. And so it's just conflating two different definitions of imposition there.
Yeah, I think we could probably let that go ahead.
We got a super chat from Marty Mad Scientists. Why do each of you reject the naturalist evolutionary view of morality?
Well, I'll be very quick with that. Actually, I think that's a good question. But number one, I think it leads to grossly immoral places. From my personal opinion, the evolutionary system of morality inevitably leads to something like social Darwinism, like what Adolf Hitler was talking about. And for the life of me, I have not been able to figure out anything wrong with the social Darwinist model, assuming evolutionary morality to be true. He wants to get rid of things like mental handicaps, physical handicaps, all that other kind of stuff. In other words, the physical nature of our race, our human race, would be better if social Darwinism actually was, something we move forward with. Now, I've never had a conversation with social Darwinist philosophers, but I have had plenty of conversations with like biologists and stuff like that, or just atheists here, like Negation of P, Matthew Steele, people like that. And I have noticed that's consistently a hang up for them. In other words, whenever I ask that question, whether it's Negation of P, Matthew Steele, Michael the Canadian Atheist, etc., they always say, you know what, that's a good point. I don't know if I can necessarily answer that question. Now, they're obviously not professional philosophers, but what it tells me is that it probably is true.
What was the question?
If the evolutionary model of morality is true, how do we avoid something like social Darwinism, which just from a physical perspective would make the species better? Right? It would make us taller, it'd make us stronger, it'd make us get rid of things like mental and physical handicaps and stuff like that. That's obviously greater evolution. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, pragmatic. So, like, social Darwinism, or if naturalistic evolution was true, then morality is purely subjective. It's not objective, and so it wouldn't be moral to eugenics people, but it would be pragmatic. It would pragmatically work to generate better people, but that wouldn't be a consequence of evolution, because evolution doesn't say anything's moral. It just says morality is a product of evolution, and nothing is morally correct or morally incorrect. And then that would lead to the fact that whatever our intuitions guide us towards is the correct interpretation of evolutionary morality, which would be not eugenics. So we tend to think that intuitionally eugenics is wrong, and therefore evolution has given us the intuition that we shouldn't eugenics people. And so it would be to go against evolutionary psychology to eugenics people, because the intuitions that it gives us are to not do that.
I think that could be true for some. To be honest, I think we're a little bit biased in the West because we live in such a, kind of peachy keen kind of world. But like, for example, in the rest of the world in the 21st century, 2022, here on August 4th, a lot of people don't actually think that. China, and in fact, a lot of people in places that are very advanced, like China's got they're not primitive by any stretch of the imagination. They just simply don't seem to have much of a care for things like mass death and stuff like that. Now, there's reasons for that historically, right? They've had a lot of mass death go on. There's a massive population. They have a lot of really detached philosophies like Buddhism.
Well, do you think, I mean, the government kills people, but do you think, I mean, most of the people think it's immoral what they're doing. They just can't speak out against it because they also get killed. So it's not like the people of China are okay with eugenics and are okay with imprisoning people. It's mostly that they can't speak out against it because they'll be killed themselves. So I don't think like the morals of the Chinese people are okay with eugenics. Like the Chinese immigrants who like live in America aren't okay with eugenics. The Chinese immigrants to other countries aren't okay with it. So I think it has more to do with the political climate than the moral climate of Chinese people.
I would say it's more of a cultural climate. In other words, I think that the history of mass death and philosophy in China, combined with the population, combined with the way that they're raised, which of course is a consequence of the state, leads people to have a very detached view of life in such a way that it's like, okay, this isn't necessarily problematic for us. And I think that's something you can see very often. In fact, even in the West, you have something like abortion. Culturally, we have a detached view of that. Whereas, for example, in Afghanistan, you're certainly not going to, right? Their culture is such that they would value life in the womb very strongly, primarily because of things like, Islam and, just other different cultural factors in there. But my point there is just to say there's obviously nothing inherently wrong about, Chinese people or anything like that. But you can have that history, you can have that culture, you can have that philosophy lead you to such an extent that you don't really find anything necessarily immoral in these actions.
I wouldn't, because I've met a number of Chinese people. My dad went to China, and I don't see that in the Chinese people. So I need more data to try to confirm that Chinese people are okay with eugenics, because I don't think they are. I'm pretty sure that moral progress and the evidence we have of moral progress throughout all societies all everywhere in the world is a pattern against that. I do not see that.
Well, I guess I would just want to ask kind of a pretty straightforward question. If it wasn't something that they were okay with, how could it happen? And I know the answer
would be the government shoots people that disagree. That's how it happens.
Right,
like,
but
why do taxes happen? Because the government's going to put you in prison. It's not like everyone in America is okay with taxes.
Not everyone in America, but the majority is, right? And that's kind of my point. Is like you have to.
Everyone hates taxes.
Well, let's make sure we're
like the majority of
here,
people
though, right?
are like the majority of people are for legalization of marijuana. Marijuana is not legal. The majority of people are for abortion rights. Abortion rights now just got overturned in Roe v. Wade. There are lots and lots of policies that the majority of Americans are for that the government is against. Just because the majority of Americans or the majority of a populace, even in a democratic state, doesn't mean that those policies are going to be enacted by the government. And so it's especially not the case that the majority of people in China may agree on some policy and that policy would be represented by the political group in China. So I don't think there's no connection between the majority of people believe it, therefore the government's going to adhere to it, especially in a totalitarian state like China or North Korea or anywhere with dictators. So I don't think there's a connection between those two. That you can't. I don't think you can draw a connection between those two.
See, and I think I would disagree because my main reason, everybody's heard the quote, government is by consent of the governed, right? That's obviously meant to be a principle of popular sovereignty, but it's also, I think, just a truism. I don't think, like, for example, in Nazi Germany, there's let me actually use a example from a television show that is supposed to be displaying Nazi Germany. Band of Brothers, if anybody's ever seen that. There's a scene very near the end where the Jewish soldier in the American troop goes to one of the Germans, and the guy's just saying, I'm not a Nazi, I didn't do it, anything like that. And he says, basically bullshit, you couldn't smell the smoke, kind of thing, right? And the sort of underlying assumption that soldier is making in that scene is, if you guys really didn't approve of this, it wouldn't be happening, right? You could have stopped it in some way, because there's millions of you, there's only a couple of them, and nobody is capable of actually forcing an entire state to do something entirely against their will. I think that's you use some good examples here with marijuana. So marijuana, the majority of people do want marijuana to be legal, and that's the direction the country is going. On a state level, it doesn't seem like the federal government's going to do anything about that anytime soon, even though it's not their place constitutionally, but I digress. It does seem like,
I just want to give up the slavery. There were lots and lots and lots of slaves, far more slaves than slave owners in many regions in the world. They didn't consent to being slaves, but they couldn't really stop anybody or do anything about it because they didn't have a military. So the fact that there's more people that disagree does not mean that that's going to have an influence on the policies that are going to stop it.
But notice with that example too, right?
Works.
Even think of that example, though. The population of America was primarily against slavery.
I wasn't talking about America. I was talking about overall in the world. So like there are regions like in Rome where there were lots and lots of slaves, like entire cities of mostly slaves, and they didn't get to go out of slavery because there were a majority of slaves there, because there's guys with swords and training and better foods. And so it's not the case that majority rules in cases like it's in fact it's like the opposite of the case. The vast majority of serfs did not like being serfs in the Middle Ages. It's not the case.
I don't know. I think I got to be honest. I think that's not a necessarily accurate view. I mean, just think of it. Let me use another biblical example, right? Where it talks about slavery. It typically, even though some of these people are slaves, like Philemon, for example, was a slave, it typically enforces the status quo there. Don't go out and seek, some sort of a rebellion against the state kind of idea. Slaves honor your masters is even a direct quote there, right? So when it comes to even the enslaved populations, they're very often not thinking of it the same way we're thinking of it, where it's like, we got to just entirely get rid of this. But even on top of that, the majority of the population of Rome, even if you include the slaves, they certainly wanted the system of slavery, or at least they didn't have a problem with it. Whether they actively wanted it, I guess that's a little bit too far of a claim for me to make, but they certainly didn't actively dislike it, right? Now, sure, maybe some of the slaves did.
There's so many examples here. Like what you're saying doesn't make sense. Like literally the entire island of Scotland hated being run by the English. They hated it. There were many, many wars of this. They didn't get to be free because England had a bigger military. You didn't get,
right, but there's
no choice here. No, they didn't. Very briefly. So the vast majority of time, and they were conquered again. Remember, England is a part, or Scotland is a part of the UK because it was conquered. So they didn't get to be free. The vast majority of the time, they were conquered. They were owned by English. And most human history is like this. There are large swaths of land that are conquered by a different group, the Mongols. There are more people in China than the Mongols. The Mongols owned the land until the Hun, same thing. Julius Caesar had a military. The military was a smaller percent of the population than anywhere he conquered. They still obeyed. Like, literally, your examples don't make sense. The history of humanity is the vast majority of people are governed by a minority who have a military, and you don't get a say. It doesn't matter if you don't like it. Scots didn't like it. The Irish didn't like it. The people who were under Attila the Hun didn't like it. The Mongols, the people who conquered, the Mongols conquered, didn't like it. Nobody likes being conquered by another military and then having all of your women and cattle stolen and you can do nothing about it. They don't like that, but they can't do anything about it because it's a military. So it's like history.
Well, I think you're kind of missing my point, though, right? And we'll stick there with the Scotland one, right? So Scotland certainly didn't like the act of being conquered, right? And they didn't like when they were under the rule of England. And so they fought back and they eventually won their freedom. And that's my point. As soon as you have decided, I don't like this thing and I'm going to do something about it, the ruling elites there are going to have a problem. They're not going to be able to actually maintain this system because it's just a simple numbers game at that point. And Scotland was free for like 500 years before eventually being
Scotland
unified.
Lost more than they won. The fact that they won at one point in time is irrelevant. They lost. Most people who fight against the people with the military lose. Winning is rare. And so your example,
that's not
Scotland, if they don't like it, they're going to lose most of the time, and they're not going to be able to change it most of the time. Only a very small minority of people actually win at the end and get freedom. So the vast majority of all of history proves your statement wrong. The vast majority lose. Like Africa, they never got freedom from the British. The British just won everything. American Indians,
because they're free now, right? But even to stick with
hated the settlers, didn't get a choice. They were forced to do it. Like, all of history is the exact opposite of what you're saying.
Well, so let's just stick with the Scottish example for a moment, just to not muddy the thing real quick, right? Scotland was actually independent for almost 1,000 years. Now, with some small areas of not, like, for example, during the time of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, they had to fight wars of independence because the English had conquered them. But we're talking about like the 1200s, early 1300s, right? But they established the kingdom in, I believe, the 800s. And they didn't end up becoming part of the UK until the Union of the Crowns. Now, the Union of the Crowns only happened because the King of Scotland and the King of England were the same person by marriage rights. And that first person was actually King James, who gave us our King James Bible. So there wasn't any imposition of the Scottish people's will there.
There was like, this started way before the English. So like the Vikings conquered the Scots, and before the Vikings was the Eskimo conquer the Scots. There was no point in time where they were not being conquered and owned by somebody else. It just doesn't happen. It's just not in history.
They were independent. I'm telling you, they were independent for almost 1,000 years. The Scottish kingdom, I'm fairly certain it was the 800s that the Scottish kingdom was first established. And it's 1707 that the Union of the Crowns takes place. Now, there is a Scottish War of Independence in between those two dates, which is where you get William Wallace and Robert the Bruce. But it was a very temporary thing. And that's exactly my point.
Before that was the Norsemen. The Norsemen were conquering all about the 700s and 800s. So there was no time. There was zero time where the people were free. They were all conquered by different groups. It was the Norsemen, then the English, and the French. And there is no time in history where the majority of people disagree and they can revolt. Doesn't happen. It's never, ever, ever does that is not a successful model. If you are owned, there's some minority people in power, they tell you what to do, and if you disagree, you die. That is the consensus among history. It just there's no justifiable way to argue that if a lot of people disagree, it'll just change. It's not how facts work.
See, I would just disagree with that. I think history demonstrates to us that once the people do get it in their head, they are not going to be ruled by this. An unrulable population is certainly unrulable. And again, the Scottish example is a perfect example of that. I know you were saying that there's no time they weren't free, but it's just not the case. They were free for a very long time. Apartheid South Africa is another good example of this. You had a small minority. That small minority was only able to rule for a time. because in the end, once the majority realized we got 90% and we don't like this, is just a simple matter of boom, like that, less than a generation, and all of a sudden the majority doesn't have its power there. And I think that's really the point that I'm trying to make, though, is that culturally speaking, you have to pacify the population to either not care enough to do anything about it or outright accept it. But if you have a population that's actively against something, it's just a matter of time that will inevitably fall.
Or you wipe them out and kill them all, which is what more normally happens.
Right, but when that happens, notice that you have a different situation, right? You're not, in other words, we're not ruling over the Wampanoag tribe. We destroyed the Wampanoag tribe, right?
Yes, and then all of the other tribes take that as an example and don't do anything because they're going to get wiped out too. That's what normally happens. Yahweh tested by fire. Yes, the Eskimos invaded the Vikings regularly. So Eskimos were very violent, and they invaded the Vikings. Look up your history stuff.
I think that was in Greenland, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's a.
Oh, but I never got to answer the super chat. The super chat was, why do you reject the naturalist evolutionary view of morality?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I reject it because I think that there's a consistent pattern in morality, and that consistent pattern is going to hold true for all conscious agents, including AIs, which are not evolved, and anything in the universe. And so we're going to see this pattern throughout all life in the universe, whether it's evolved or not. And if that's the case, then it's not a product of evolution. That's why I don't accept it.
Let's see here. I do have a question here I want to just briefly address in my own life, which I had about, should morality be enforced by the Noahide laws or a moral system most in conformity with them? No. Just that simple. Noahide laws can be good, but the actual system of Noahide laws is it's a Jewish construct. I'm not religiously Jewish, ethnically Jewish, but not religiously Jewish, so wouldn't. Anyways, back to our conversation there.
I got a few more questions actually. So Vlad asks, hypothetically, if someone killed your immediate loved one, would you want to take your murderer's life? Sure.
So I mean, emotionally, probably yes. I think the deeper question would be, is it just? And in that instance, I would say yes, certainly. I think that the penalty for murder should be death penalty.
All right. Captain Rabbit says, CJ, come to the dark side. We have cookies.
Well, you know.
Cookies defeat heaven. Cookies are better than heaven. Eternal life, nah, go with the cookies. So Jane asks, talking about my morality, if you add that caveat, it would mean that the only wills could act would be amoral actions. No. In this world, you can still do moral and immoral things. You just have to have someone in their universe allow actions that are immoral. So you can allow murder or rape in your universe. It's still immoral, but you can turn up the difficulty on a video game kind of a thing. So if I am playing Dark Souls, I could turn on God mode and make it instant win for me, or I can turn up the difficulty and ask someone's help to beat the boss. They can teach me how to beat the boss, and that would be a moral action. So you can still do moral and immoral actions in the best of all possible worlds if someone consensually allows those actions to take place in their universe. Vlad wants to know what your stance is on January 6th.
He's talking about the Trump thing, right? With the
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I thought it was stupid. I don't think it's an insurrection. I think that's way overblown. Realistically speaking, it seems to me like a bunch of people who did a really stupid thing for a couple of hours and then they went home. Now let me say I would be much more willing to see January 6th in a more negative light if it wasn't for what I see as a severe double standard. In other words, I do see what happened in 2020 as an actual insurrection. In fact, they literally had the Capitol Hill autonomous zone. Let's look up the word autonomous zone. They were declaring themselves an independent government, and they were pursuing different avenues of a government. Right? They were going around extorting businesses for taxes and stuff like that. That is a real insurrection. It lasted like a month. what happened to January 6th was a bunch of really stupid people doing something that was really stupid. I don't support them, but I don't think it was an insurrection. Now, would my view of that change if it wasn't for the fact that we have that double standard? It might. I'll certainly acknowledge that. I wouldn't be as dismissive of it if we weren't so dismissive of 2020. But it does seem to me like we're just kind of applying, oh, this over here, I don't agree with these guys, so that's an insurrection. And this over here, I do agree with these guys, so that's not an insurrection. And I don't like that. It annoys me.
Yeah, I don't think I would call it an insurrection either. I think that for it to qualify as an insurrection, they have to have some like proposed methodology to take over or change the results, and that seemed more like a violent protest more than an insurrection. I don't think they had any. No one in the group actually had a planned methodology where they could actually legitimately try to change the results or replace the people in power somehow. I don't know if that could have been a thing.
Yeah, I'd completely agree, and even with that beginning portion too, right? As far as a violent protest, I'd definitely agree there too. It's certainly not something that should have happened. I wouldn't endorse it by any stretch. But it did get weird. I mean, like you get Nancy Pelosi talking about like the sacred ground of our democracy and stuff like that. It's like, okay, this is a real bizarre language. Whereas on the flip side of other things that have occurred, it's like we wouldn't dare use such language. I mean, the sacred grounds of democracy, quote unquote, in numerous states were certainly assaulted. And I don't know, maybe it's even unfair to always compare 2020 with January 6th, but they are so close in proximity with each other and opposite sides doing what seems like the same thing that it seems like you're always going to have to take them one with the other. At any rate, though, that's my answer there. I hope that suffices for the questioner.
Yeah, some people in the chat are complaining. Like, I understand an insurrection as like a government overthrowing the government in some way, not just being violent and going against the government. Every protest is violent and goes against the government. That's not an insurrection. So an insurrection is like a positive attempt to overcome the government, to overthrow the government in some way. And I don't think the January 6th rioters had any ability to do that. I don't say they got into the Capitol, then what? How are they going to overthrow the government, even if they all got into the Capitol? Like, the only possible avenue would be like if they kidnapped all the senators or something, or like started killing senators, then yeah, absolutely. At that point, it's definitely an insurrection. Do I think they would have actually done that? I don't know.
Well, and one other thing I would add to it too, and by the way, just for the record, I am not a Donald Trump fan, but I don't think that he had as much to do with that as people are claiming. First off, I think some of the stuff that's happened to the January 6th committee has just been flagrantly BS. Like, he definitely did not jump up 3 seats forward in a limousine and start choking the guy who was driving. That didn't happen for sure. I don't care how many times that the guy says it happened. I do not believe him unless he gives me some like actual evidence to demonstrate it, because that seems to be physically impossible given the configuration of the car. I don't like the dude. I don't think he ever should have been the president of the United States, despite my conservative values. But the idea that he was like actively endorsing overthrow of the government, I don't think that's true at all. I think he said numerous times during that day that there should be no violence, that people should be protesting peacefully and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know.
A Brute Facts podcast, Eddie from Brute Facts says, "Come stay in CJ." I don't know what that means. Come stay in CJ. As Christians, we must absolutely condemn as harshly as possible, considering they called themselves Christians and even prayed during the January 6th thing.
I don't know. I guess I just don't necessarily think that is true. I think that, to be honest, to a certain extent, you reap what you sow. I mean, if we're going to allow violence to be a legitimate means of political grievance, which we've definitely done, not just 2020, but going all the way back to 2017 with Berkeley and Chancellorsville, the thing over the Confederate statue. I can't even remember what it was. Charlottesville. Was it Charlottesville?
I think so.
Yeah. Anyways, the point is, we've allowed violence to become a legitimate means of expressing your political grievance. And I think it's super inconsistent to say all of a sudden when Trump did it, now it's bad. Or when Trumpers did it, to be more precise, now it's bad. Now it is bad. Again, I don't endorse it by any stretch of the imagination. But you plant those kinds of seeds, you're going to get that kind of wheat.
think that's all I got for super chats.
For sure, for sure. Well, we have hit about an hour and 35 minutes here, it looks like. So you've actually given us more time than we originally allotted. So I think now would probably be a good time to wrap up. This has been a very good conversation, I think.
Yep. Thanks for inviting me on. Appreciate it. Nice talking with you as always.
Absolutely, man. Let's do it again sometime.
Yep. See ya.
Have a good rest of your day. And for the rest of the audience, let me say, if you liked this video, please consider liking and sharing this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Thought this was a very interesting conversation. We got to explore TJump's imposition of will model more than I've ever gotten to do in the past. So I certainly do appreciate that, and I appreciate him coming on. If you guys have any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, anything of that nature, please feel free to throw them in the live chat. Let me know if you thought that I was just an absolute waste of time and am an embarrassment to Christianity, or if I'm like the greatest thing since C.S. Lewis, or anything in between. Obviously, I'm joking, but seriously though, give your critiques down below. I do covet them. I want to make sure we're doing this in as positive a way as possible. I seek to do this for a career, which is very difficult to do because you got to make sure you're doing it correctly, right? So appreciate you guys. Hopefully we'll have that episode of Breakfast Tea airing today. We'll be back tomorrow, Lord willing, at around 10 p.m. Mountain Time with a open mic, Sabbath night open mic. And every single one of you who is here, Alec, Kelvy, Andrew, Jamie, CM Gould, I appreciate you all. If the Lord wills and tarries, we'll be seeing you here soon.